I want to introduce our panel this afternoon. It's diverse and I think will be very helpful to us. We're going to start off with the assumption that not everybody has read Centesimus Annus. And so Peter Hebblethwaite, who was introduced to you last night, and most of you met him then, is going to give us about a 10-minute capsule overview of what the document is about. And then Paul Hansen, who is immediately to Peter's left, is going to, Paul and Janet and Terry are going to comment on the document from their own perspective. And I just want to introduce the three of them briefly. Paul is a redemptorist priest from Toronto. And as I was thinking about him this morning when Francis was speaking of the coalitions, I was saying to myself, Paul must be Mr. Coalition or maybe Father Coalition, because I think he has been involved in most of the coalitions around Toronto and is extremely well known for his work in social justice in the area. He is also a world traveller for his community, the Redemptorist community, and has worked for them in many parts of the world, in many areas of social justice, and has lived in base communities all over the world, and is very well known as a spokesperson for social justice in and around Toronto, to me, but also all over the world. Janet Conway graduated from TST, and Paul, sorry, before I finish, Paul will speak from his perspective as a world justice traveller on Centesimus Annus.
A redemptorist.
Sounds like, yeah, a redemptorist, yes, that's right. Janet graduated from Toronto School of Theology a few years back in social ethics, and did her thesis on feminist theology and ecology. She's a social justice worker for women's issues and poverty at Holy Trinity Anglican Church, which is in downtown Toronto behind the Eaton Centre. I don't know if you've ever ventured through the Eaton Centre. Back there, there's a little church which is the centre of a lot of very creative activity around Toronto. Janet is an activist in the feminist movement and will comment on Centesimus Annus from that perspective. Terry Downey, to my immediate right here, is local. He teaches across what we say here, across the creek, at the University of Waterloo in the Political Science Department. And his specialty is public policy and government business relations. Terry has been awarded the University of Waterloo Distinguished Teacher Award, and just last year, I think it was, he was awarded the St. Jerome's Distinguished Graduate Award. He is a distinguished graduate of this institution here. And Terry will comment on a humble distinguished graduate of this institution. Terry will comment on Centesimus Annus from his own perspective of political science. And if you're a reader of Grail, you've probably already read some of his articles in that area. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the panel to you. When all four presentations have been made, we will probably have a bit of a break at that time. And then just to get some response. Then Peter will give some response just from his own perspective, again, as just to use our colloquial language here, Mr. Vatican for the moment. And this afternoon we have arranged a coffee break afterwards up in the common room. So right after this, at sometime between 2:30 and 3 o'clock, there's a coffee break laid out for us up there. Just it's in a little more relaxed surroundings. Okay? Peter, thank you very much. Would you please welcome our panel?
What I intend to do is to give you the context for understanding this encyclical. It won't supply for not having read it, but should help, I hope. Almost every anniversary of Rerum Novarum, 1891, somebody's thought of celebrating it in one way or another. Quadragesimo anno, the 40th year, was 1931. If you are in your 60s, that probably is the social doctrine of the Church that you were brought up on in your childhood. but my historical work has shown that if you were an Italian or a German Catholic in the 1930s, looking for some ground to stand on to resist fascism or Nazism, you wouldn't have found the social doctrine, or you wouldn't have found Quadragesimo Anno much use. You'd have had to turn to Jacques Maritain. That's actually quite an important point, because it enables me to make my distinction between papal social teaching, which is what it is, and Catholic social thinking, which is what it is. It's different and it's sometimes better. But the more immediate context is the last social encyclical of John Paul II, which was in 1987. It was called Solicitudo Rerum Socialum, concern for social matters. And my newspaper, the National Catholic Reporter, made a great fuss of it, got 7 experts, including an ecologist and a woman, she was the same person, to praise it and say Pope John Paul II's gift to humanity. So we thought it was great. What we thought was great in particular was the way it put on the same basis the Soviet Empire and US imperialism. We thought that was rather good. The both imperialisms, twin imperialisms, glaring at each other, still the Cold War, and both were castigated, which incidentally is something very characteristic of papal social teaching. Very characteristic. It is to say a plague on both your houses. On the one hand, liberalism, by which is meant individualism, and on the other hand, collectivism, socialism. So where are we? Striking boldly down the middle of the fairway? That's a question to be discussed. Now, when Solicitudo Rerum Socialum appeared, Michael Novak and his chums were so upset at this slur on American democracy, because they believe that democracy is the finest form of government and that it leads to the practice of justice ipso facto, rushed to Rome to complain and to make sure that they had misunderstood this text, or the Pope couldn't possibly mean what he appeared to mean. Well, they got a rather dusty reception, and it seems that he did mean what he appeared to mean. He was saying a plague on both your imperialist houses. Well, now we come to the present, and between 1987 and 1991, it's obvious that a number of things have happened. And I think you can say that the hour of Catholic social teaching has struck. Why do I say that? Well, because in Eastern Europe, throughout Central and Eastern Europe, there is a political vacuum. We hear about the spiritual vacuum, but I think the political vacuum, the absence of political philosophy, the absence of the very building blocks with which you can build up political society, civil society, is very striking. What is a political party? What is a political party for? There are over 100 political parties in Poland, and you can't do anything with that. Somebody plaintively says to me in Poland, can you have politics without political parties? Why not, Well, they've still got a long way to go, so I think that this encyclical is in many ways addressed to that situation more than to us. They are in one sense back to 1945. They're back in that position when they have to start all over again. It's as though they've been in the deep freezer for the last 40 years from the political point of view. But this same sense of this could be the hour of Catholic social doctrine, even in Britain, even in little old England, I find as well. In political thinking, we have on the one hand the failed collectivisms of Eastern Europe, and we have the failed individualism of Thatcherism, which is now recognized. But what is there between? Well, Professor Bernard Crick, editor of the Political Quarterly, has adopted a typically British solution to this. He has founded a dining club. So we dine at the Savage Club, and we discuss, well, what? Community, public good, public interest. These kinds of concepts are the concepts that we need, that everybody needs. Suddenly political philosophy becomes a relevant subject. It always has been, of course. But it becomes one that's open and important. People need to know about it. Catholic social doctrine is summed up, I think, in the two words. The way in which it's relevant here, it's summed up in two words, both of which, by the way, are used by the European community. The whole vocabulary of the European community is the vocabulary of Catholic social doctrine. Even John Major managed to pronounce the word subsidiarity in the House of Commons, and it was a very big word for him. And you all know what subsidiarity means. It means don't put up to a higher level that which can be dealt with on the lower level. There's an appropriate level for decision-making in everything. Of course, in 1985 they told us that principle didn't apply to the life of the church. It applied to the political community. So that's one key word. The other key word is solidarity. With solidarity and subsidiarity, you have the essence of Catholic social thinking. With that, we can turn to the encyclical, which I think perhaps makes a contribution to, if you like, if there is to be a new world order, it needs a new world ethic. And Edward Shevardnadze, who's a man I greatly admire, and he happened to see the Pope in February, that's nothing to do with it, but he did. He's made the very simple point that the New World Order, we Russians, we've heard talk of the New World this and the New that, the New Woman, and the New Society and so on. It doesn't mean anything to us anymore. But what really matters is that system of legality in human relationships and an ordered way of dealing with differences of opinion in society, so that you don't find it necessary to shoot your political opponents all the time. If one can extend that gradually more and more throughout society into international relations and so on, then bit by bit one might manage to construct something like a new world order. And I think this encyclical serves that purpose as well. Unfortunately, I will now tell you what's in its 6 chapters. Unfortunately, in its first chapter, which commemorates Rerum Novarum, the formal object of this thing, it is so extravagant in its assertions about Rerum Novarum that it completely undermines its own credibility. From which I conclude that there are 2 hands at work in this, which I called in one article Dr. Jekyll of Krakow and Professor Hyde of Warsaw. It's the Pope in different guises. In one he's very triumphalistic, and which inscribes the social legislation of every country in the world pretty well to Rerum Novarum in 1891, which is totally implausible and just not true. Rerum Novarum was written against, on the one hand, socialism, and on the other hand, liberalism, which were the modern thing in 1891. So it was just as much written against the modern world as the syllabus of errors was. However, let that pass. Chapter 2 deals with the new things of today. It's an attempt to say what's new about the present situation. It's an attempt to read the signs of the times. Somebody raised this morning the question of who is reading the signs of the times. Yes, indeed, not women. Chapter 3 is the most intriguing chapter of all. I think possibly the most intriguing chapter in the entire corpus of papal social doctrine. It's called The Year 1989. And what's intriguing about that is simply that the Pope should be reflecting on an historical event. I know no example of this happening before, or not an historical event with a date on it anyway. Okay, Pius VI, this is showing off you. Pius VI did condemn the French Revolution, or at least the French civil constitution of the clergy, in 1792. So that was a reflection on an event, in a sense, a most unfortunate one. That this is something different and something more profound. And were the events of 1989 providential, and in what sense? Now that is also the subject of the synod, which is taking place from November the 28th to December the 14th, which I spoke about on Wednesday night. And if, incidentally, anybody who wasn't there on Wednesday night would like a copy of the agenda for that synod, I have some and would gladly share them with you, because I didn't want to take them back to England. So, Chapter 3, I think, is in many ways, what are we to make of this event, these events, these people coming to their liberty? What was God doing in all that? Chapter 4 is probably the one on which a political or an economist would concentrate. It's private property and what's called the universal destination of all the world's goods. What does this extraordinary phrase mean? It's the justification for Robin Hood. That's to say, robbing the rich to pay the poor. It's all the world's goods, this great profusion of goods, are for all. So if you've got masses and I've got nothing, then something's gone wrong. There's a state of injustice, which I can remedy by stealing your apples. Well, that's, broadly speaking, the idea. But in modern international terms, you can see that all the business of GATT in terms of trade and so on, the Uruguay round, would come into that. There's inequalities in the international system. One novelty that's pointed out there is the idea of intellectual property, that property isn't just owning land or owning goods or controlling services. There's a form of intellectual property which comes through the possession of software and hardware, in which countries can have, which the developed countries, the G7 countries, have an enormous advantage over the rest of the world and intend to retain it. Chapter 5 is called State and Culture. This is a use of culture most of us are not very familiar with. It's the anthropological use of culture. It doesn't mean string quartets or Shakespeare. Culture is the ambience, it's the air we breathe. Culture is what's all about us. It's the assumptions that are made by our society. The most important passage in that, for my money, is in number 46, which is about democracy. It says the church has always... No, it doesn't say that. Couldn't say that. I was going to say it says the church has always valued the democratic system. It doesn't. It says the church values the democratic system. And this is particularly interesting because it is new, to put it so clearly. And the interesting thing is why values the democratic system. Because it makes rulers accountable, because it imposes checks and balances on them, and because it enables them to be changed without a revolution. Those are, well, if you've just come out of communism, these are very important values. That's why it's particularly sad that it looks as though in the Polish election on October 28th, probably less than half the electorate are going to vote. Chapter 6 is called Man is the Way of the Church. Heaven knows what that means. The Pope keeps on repeating it. He said it in his opening speech. And should we translate it legitimately? The human person is the way of the church.
That's not what he thinks.
It doesn't mean quite the same thing. It certainly doesn't mean the male is the way of the church. So I think it's his way of trying to say that Christianity is a form of humanism. And that is the encyclical in 10 minutes flat.
Thank you, Peter. Just by way of a quick little bridge comment, Peter suggested that Eastern Europe is coming out of a tremendous vacuum, and that in the minds of many, it's Catholic social teaching that is a focus to help bring that Eastern European political reality into the future. So much so that just recently Cardinal Etchegaray attended a meeting in Moscow where he advised, actually, Soviet leadership to seriously consider taking the last 100 years of Catholic social teaching as a bulwark of its new political process. I think that points up the kind of struggling that's going on there at the moment. Jesse Jackson one time said, I love Jesse. Jesse Jackson one time said, every text without a context is a pretext. And so that's what I propose to do this afternoon. In a sense, put the text of the encyclical and also the text of my own life and the text of our lives in North America into the context of a few little reflections that I have that I've recently picked up in my travels, if you will. A month ago, I came back from 7 weeks in Europe, 5 of them involved in conversations around the Eastern European experience. Some would say that November the 9th, 1989, and here's a piece of the Berlin Wall, I personally hacked it off. November the 9th, 1989 was the close of modern history. If you have a European perspective, that of course would be, I think, a comment worth pondering. That with 1989 came the close of modern history as we've known it. And as you know, Europe is redefining itself in ways that are now to its glory. In fact, I noticed this summer that North Americans were tolerated at best in conversations of any kind of academic and insightful comment about where are we going now. In fact, that the Cold War has ended and the nuclear weapons have been cut back and all those kinds of things are happening, we are still the colonies. And that posture is presented now very strongly in Europe. So I think in some ways the Pope, in writing this encyclical, is making a statement about 1989. And he's making a statement that he, a leader from the East, will be a major actor in the new Europe to be. And as you know, a second context of the encyclical for me is 1992. And I refer to 1992, the unification of Europe. And one of the things that I think is awfully important to appreciate in this is the story that was played up on our journal, the CBC's journal by Brian Stewart. It appeared twice, I believe, at least I saw it twice, where it was entitled Europe Unbound. And what I found fascinating in Stewart's presentation was the fact that he maintained that in this unification of Europe, it was only the captains of capital that are defining the new Europe. That really the European Parliament is a poetry at best, in the bad sense of the use of that word, poetry. And not only that, but he had the president and chief executive officer of Philips, the big Dutch corporation, on to indicate that he, this captain of capital, was upset that economics was the only language in this redefinition of Europe, implying, of course, that that will be the detriment of the family of Europe, of the human presence of Europe. And so I think in 1992, that kind of a context is very important to appreciating this encyclical. I think also a context to appreciate it is the Gulf War. I think the Gulf War showed us something. It showed the Pope certainly something. I think what it showed us was that traditionally we have tended to associate empire with a nation state. The Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, the American Empire. With the Gulf War, I think we saw in spades that empire is no longer related to nation state, but rather empire is capital that has a political wing and a military arm. Transnational capital is empire. I say that because if we don't appreciate that dynamic, and I'm offering that as my sense of what is going on, then I don't think we can understand the encyclical, nor do I think are we able to see that in some instances the encyclical, in some of its appreciations of capital, is quite naive. That would be my sensitivity. And thirdly, or fourthly, an experience or a context that I would like to hold before us is that of the 500-year celebration or repentance. Because as much as we talk about a unification of Europe, and I think this is an encyclical of and for Europe, we also are at a time when we have a North-South dialogue going on. And I was sharing with Peter earlier A year ago, I attended at the Humboldt University in East Berlin a symposium 1 week long where Frei Beto and Leonardo Boff from Brazil were present. And we were discussing, and they were discussing primarily, what is the role now of liberation theology in light of this new Europe? And what is the role in the plight of the peoples of Brazil and Africa and Asia, now with the coming together of the United North? Will countries like Brazil and countries of Africa only be of importance to the family on this planet to the degree that they can supply natural resources or raw materials to enhance our way of life, but the real transfer of money will now be east-west? In fact, a president of one of the banks of Canada suggested that, and when I retorted off the record, he demanded that was racism. He said, but Paul, my God, the citizens of Canada, aren't we from Lithuania? Aren't we from Czechoslovakia? Aren't we from East Germany? They are like us. They are more accountable in matters of economics. And so I think those, for me, are the context in which we have to hold this whole discussion and this whole, I would almost say, prophetic presence that the Pope thinks himself to be in with the coming together of Europe and with the synod coming up that Peter alluded to. With regard to the encyclical proper, all I would have to say would be 3 reflections around 3 of the chapters. The 3 chapters that I have chosen, if you will, to reflect a little bit on. The chapter number 2, Toward the New Things of Today. Chapter number 3, the year 1989. And chapter 4, Private Property and the Universal Destination of Material Goods. So chapter 2, Toward New Things of Today. The encyclical has pointed out that real socialism is a fallacy. I find it difficult to appreciate what the encyclical meant by real socialism. Did he mean Stalinism? Did he mean what was experienced in the East Bloc countries for the last 45, 50 years? What is really meant by real socialism? Because at one point in the encyclical, I believe it's number 41, the Pope talks very much about, paragraph 35, he calls the social system that of state capitalism. So I'm wondering what he means by real socialism. He points out in that chapter number 2, Toward New Things of Today, the mistaken notion of the person. That in this modern conversation about person, we have tended to define the person in terms of economics. What is the real notion of the person that we should be holding up? He talked about the first cause of our mistaken notion of the person being atheism. And he's very strongly on that of course a belief structure is crucial for human rights, for the proper sensitivities of politics, economics, and state. And of course, then he goes on in chapter 2 to call bankrupt the militarism and the Marxism of what we've experienced in the last little while. Moving on to chapter 3, the year 1989. Because of my work since 1985 with the Redemptorists, I've had occasion to be in Eastern Europe in the last 2.5 years specifically. And something that I found fascinating, and this is what I would hold up as commenting on the encyclical's naivete, in part. In East Germany, Neues Forum, a church group primarily, but of course the artists and theater people and others as well, university academicians, were the people basically who created the political space to bring the hundreds onto the streets in Leipzig, Dresden, Alexanderplatz, and so on. Were arrested, brutalized, often in very tragic ways. I've met a couple of those people. Neues Forum, the group, the leadership that did that, very quickly, with the coming down of the wall on November the 9th, 1989, were so marginalized, so dismissed, that they aren't even part of the conversation at the moment, which is interesting. I hold it up as a comment for me about the naivete of the encyclical, not appreciating the power of the Deutschmark, not appreciating the power of idolatry. And in that case, I think it is crucial for us in North America at least, to read something like this, John Francis Kavanagh's revised edition of Following Christ in a Consumer Society, Still. The second edition is entitled, because here Kavanagh presents for us capital idolatry as a religion. And it's one that has existed from the very beginning. The freedom, if you will, the liberation led by Moses, to be very simplistic, and the idolatry led by his own brother of his same household, Aaron, who was a priest. It was precisely Aaron the priest who constructed and led the worship of the golden calf. And to me, in the same household are those two competing journeys. And I think that we must appreciate capital in its idolatrous component as being and having the power of a religion. It has its high priests, it has its notions of grace, it has its preachers, it has its whole liturgies, it has things that are just so powerful that a little example might highlight that. I was talking to a group of superintendents of the school boards of Ontario, and one of the superintendents told me this story, which I then in turn tested on some grade 13 students last week, only to be astounded in how accurate the superintendent was. The question was raised, what would you rather be carrying walking along Bloor Street in Toronto? A Gucci bag with a Wilco shirt inside, or a Wilco bag with a Gucci shirt inside? And 85%, I counted them because I did a PA day with them, of grade 13 students from 5 high schools said a Wilco bag with a Gucci shirt, a Gucci bag with a Wilco shirt inside. The power of capital, the idolatry of capital is so phenomenal. And I'm suggesting that capital is the new name for empire, with a political wing and a military arm. And the Gulf War has pointed that out to us. Quickly, the Pope's recent visit to Poland this summer and to Hungary in June and July showed that the peoples of Poland are not going to replace the boot of Stalinism with the boot of an authoritarian curia. That was obvious this summer. In fact, the Pope left Poland on his way back to Rome through Hungary so upset that he immediately wrote the bishops of the world around the abortion issue. In fact, the Davenport Messenger of September 26th, a couple of weeks ago, pointed out that 31% named the church in Poland as the most trusted institution, 31%. The army had a 63% approval rating in Poland. In March of this year, the church had a 71% approval rating. It has dropped 40% since March. Finally, chapter 4, if you will, of private property and the universal destination of material goods. I suggested we read Following Christ in a Consumer Society still. I think it's also important, as Peter pointed out to us, and it's always important because people can, and this has always been for us disappointment, those of us who have been involved in justice work, because like we used to say about Scripture, the devil can quote Scripture, all sides can quote these kinds of encyclicals and find in them what they want to find. And that's what's always difficult for us. I would say that one should read, however, this encyclical, as Peter pointed out to us, holding in one hand Laborem Exercens on labor, that the Pope wrote early on in his tenure in the papacy. Because there he does point out to us, and he articulates it, I think, rather well, the priority of labor over capital. The priority of labor over capital. And the second one, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, where he points out that the needs of the poor have priority over the wants of the rich. I think that's crucial. Finally, I would just like to highlight a couple of little confusions for me. I already suggested one. In paragraph 35, he calls the socialist system state capitalism, and yet he argues the demise and the you might say the incomprehensibility, although he doesn't say it that definitively, of socialism as an option for the human agenda. Paragraph 41, he talks about the question of socialist countries and alienation. Again, it's true. We use the word socialist very, very easily and often very pauschal. But what are we really meaning here? Can one really say that East Germany was a socialist country, or was it rather a Stalinist country? And I think those kinds of distinctions are important to make. And finally, in paragraph 43, the Pope says, as Cardinal Etchegaray said in Rome or in Moscow recently, the Church has no models to present, but rather an indispensable and ideal orientation. But the part that struck me in terms of confusion was the church has no models to present. And I thought, what about the Acts of the Apostles? What about chapter 2, where there was a model of equality, of people sharing their life together? It wasn't just an orientation. It wasn't just an ideal, if you will, although it obviously did not get lived out. But it was, I think, a serious attempt at a model. And so from my limited experience, those were the contexts in which I carried around the last couple of months this encyclical.
Good afternoon. I also have a word to say about context. First of all, the context of my reading this document. I'm a Roman Catholic Christian. I'm a feminist. I work in the anti-poverty movement in Canada, and I work in the women's movement. And I work with communists, and I work with socialists, and I work with church people. And I understand my Christian commitment within the context of the movement for social change, radical social change, on behalf of people who are marginalized, and among those people, primarily women. A word about the context of the document. In addition to what other people have said, this is a post-Gulf War document. During the Gulf War, the Vatican came out in opposition to armed intervention in the Middle East by the U.S.-led UN coalition. It has been suggested by some people that this document is actually an appeasement document, that it is a response to U.S. government pressure on the heels of the Gulf War, in which the Vatican was so critical of U.S. intervention, and that this is in fact on the heels of the so-called failure of communism in Eastern Europe. This is really an appeasement to U.S. interests. So just to keep that in mind. The other thing to think about in reading these documents, who is this document for? Who are these documents for? They're often addressed to the world church or to the world's bishops. Is this a document to the world church? Is it a document to the hierarchy? Is it a document to me as a Christian and a social activist? Is it a document addressed to you? Is it a document addressed to the world's poor? Is it a document addressed to Western political leaders? Is it a document addressed to the U.S. and its allies? I'm not sure that it's very clear. I would suggest that it is not a document addressed to the world church or the real concerns of the world church. It's a document addressed to the first world and to the governments of the first world. An accompanying question: what is the intent of such documents? These documents are full of visionary language. In fact, that's probably the best that we can take from them, is that they, in some paragraphs, what it gives with one hand, it often takes away with the other. But before it takes it away, it gives us some good stuff. And in those visionary statements, there's a lot that people like me can take away and say, yes, I'm in continuity with the best of Catholic social teaching. But are these documents really meant to be implemented? Is there any program for implementation? What's the relationship between theological niceties and political practice? And do those questions, do they even enter into the minds of the writers? And are they even part of the dialogue as we struggle to receive this document? What's the relationship between theological theory and political practice? And does the reality of the political context that we are in Canada and in other parts of the world, does that inform how we receive it? Should it inform how we receive it? How should we receive this document and others like it? I think we should understand it in its context, as has been outlined, and also be always suspicious that there are many other things that we don't even know that have informed the writing of this document. Of course, we have to critique the limits of the document, and they are many. I think, for sure, people like me, I want to celebrate what it has to give me. I want to celebrate and use its central assertions about the primacy of labor and the dignity of human persons. And then I think I want to shelve it. This document is a very Eurocentric document. It's written from the perspective of the First World, I think, to the First World. The Third World is very marginal. It's mentioned marginally. And poor people are mentioned marginally. For all the talk about solidarity and a preferential option for the poor, references to poor people place them in, I think, and I would call it in a very objectified kind of category. The poor are talked about. But the document does not address the poor, the church. The poor are sort of an outsider somewhere, important to be concerned about, but not essential. And their experience certainly doesn't inform this document. Likewise, I think the poor in Canada, in the First World, are marginal to the document. So I think it's really addressed to leaders in the First World. And I think we have to understand it in that context. To try to address this document as a feminist, there's lots to say about it, and everything I say, there'll be more to say, and also everything I say, you could also go to the document and find something to contradict what I say, because what it gives with one hand, it takes away with the other. And I think that what you hear up here is no replacement for reading the document itself. First, what we can celebrate in the document. I think Frances addressed some of this morning when she talked about the tradition of Catholic social teaching. The document talks a lot about workers and about the dignity of workers and the dignity of human work and the importance of human work to being a full human being. Work as essential to human dignity and people's vocation and sense of meaning. Work as a contribution to the common good, every person's work as a contribution to the common good. And it strongly states and reiterates the rights of workers that are throughout the tradition of Catholic social teaching. The rights of workers to limited working hours, the rights to time off, the rights to leisure, the rights to safety in the workplace, the right to a just wage, which in this document and others is described as a family wage, and I'll come back to that. The document calls for the protection of workers' freedom of religion, freedom to organize. It defends the rights of workers to organize in labor unions, and says that indeed the context of the free market is not enough to protect the rights and needs of workers, that workers do need to organize, and that we can't rely on market mechanisms to protect workers. And these are the things I think in this document and in the corpus of Catholic social teaching that I can hold up and want to hold up and celebrate and reiterate and repeat. And these are the parts of this document that I will repeat. The document talks about the responsibility of the state to defend and protect the most vulnerable, the poor and the workers. Talks about the state as needing to defend the common good. So it's a clear assumption in the document that the free market economy is not sufficient to do that. That the free market needs to be limited, and that the proper role of the state is to impose those limits. And that workers' right to organize in labor unions is part of putting limits on the free market. So it's not naive or so naive as to say that, we all come into the free market as equals, and that, we'll just slug it out, and what we slug out will be right, true, and just. So, it's not that naive. And so it defends those kinds of rights, which are absolutely important, and never before in this country, recently anyway, has it been so important to reiterate those. It also strongly affirms the right and responsibility of working people to participate in the political process. and calls on Christians to participate in the political process. One of the things to be celebrated in this document is that what it says about Christianity is that Christianity is lived out in history. There's none of this otherworldly stuff. Christianity is lived out in history, and Christian commitment is lived out in history. And that it calls on Christians to participate in the workings out of the social order, to participate politically. It's not enough to go to church. It's not enough even to participate in church organizations. Christians have to get out there and participate in labor unions and in the functions of government and in popular movements and all that kind of thing. And that's also very, very important to reiterate. There's lots been said already about what the document says about socialism. And everything that it says about the rights of workers, it says in the context, really, I think, of defending the primacy of the free market. Now, it doesn't, it's a very sophisticated document. Like, this document is not simple or straightforward. It's a very sophisticated piece of work. And it will enable the church in the next century to say, as we have always taught, so we say today. And they can pick out the piece that they want to reiterate.
That's what it's called.
So that's right. So the church is defending strongly the rights of workers in this document, and it's also, I think, presuming or giving a very strong shot in the arm to a free market ideology. And part of the way in which it does that is this notion that the collapse of communism or state capitalism in Eastern Europe means that socialism is dead. And that this is proof that socialism is dead. Now, what that presumes, of course, is that there is only one kind of socialism. In fact, there are many kinds of socialisms, and there are many people around the world, especially people who are working with poor people and struggling for real social change, who find Marxist categories the most helpful ones in which to do that. I mean, Marx made a preferential option for the oppressed. It's a very biblical option. And Marx made it in economic terms. And Christians around the world who are struggling to be in solidarity with poor people find Marxist categories of understanding the political economy very useful, or the most useful ones we have at the moment. Now, no one's saying that they're perfect. Absolutely not. And socialist attempts at socialist governments around the world have met all kinds of trouble, both from internal forces and external forces. But the presumption in the document, or what the document fails to take into account, is that there are many kinds of socialisms, that Marxism itself is a tradition. It's not static. It's not a handbook that you pull out of your pocket and apply to the political order of the day. It's a tradition in and of itself that is developing. And I think does not take at all into account the people who are struggling around the world and finding Marxist terms of analysis the most useful ones. The other thing I think to say about what the document says about socialism is that, the church's big problem with Marxism or socialism or communism, and all those terms are kind of used interchangeably, is that it's atheist. So that the experience of the church in East of course, was that the church was suppressed. But there's no serious encounter with those parts of the world where the churches, or portions of the church, and for example in Latin America, the portions of the church in solidarity with the poor are working side by side with Marxists. And there is that attempt to try to bring those two traditions into some kind of mutual political partnership without any kind of naivete around that, or the struggles around that. But atheism, of course, is one reason why the church has traditionally rejected Marxism. The other one is the notion of class conflict or class struggle. And this document strongly, again, rejects the notion of class struggle. Now, what I say, on one hand, it says workers need to organize, and that the free market is not enough to protect the rights of workers. But on the other hand, it says there's no such thing as class struggle. And it says that these things, that the conflicts that are within society, and the document acknowledges that there are conflicts, says can and should be resolved through dialogue. Now, my view of this, and again as a person who's working on the ground in this country, is that that's a very, very naive view of the depth of social conflict that we have even in this country. The depth of social conflict and the depth of conflicting agendas and conflicting needs, and also the gross imbalance of power between the haves and the have-nots. And that the notion that these differences can be resolved simply through dialogue, I think, is a very, very naive notion. Now I say that I'm not endorsing armed struggle, so don't go away and quote that. I'm endorsing armed struggle. And this document clearly doesn't endorse armed struggle and raises critical questions about it. And there are critical questions being raised all over the world, even by people who have engaged in armed struggle, about its usefulness. But the notion that the level of social conflict is such that it can be resolved through dialogue and cooperation, I think is simply unfounded. And if we take our historical experience seriously in this country and other countries, this is a struggle. It is not a discussion. It is a struggle. And I think that's, when we talk about putting an option for the poor into political practice, those are the kinds of questions we need to struggle with. It's not enough to talk about two equals coming into conversation to work out their differences. We're talking about people who have nothing or very little and people who have a lot, everything. And these two groups of people, very few people here, a lot of people, and growing number of people here, do not come to the table as equals. And even though there are many more poor people and a growing number of poor people and many fewer rich people and people with that kind of power, the power is here in capital and in resources, and it's transnational. I mean, it's not even subject to national laws. So the whole notion of social conflict. So there are very serious questions, I think, to be raised about what this document says about socialism and what it says about social conflict and how it can be resolved. On one hand, the document calls for full employment, that everybody has a right to work, and that if they're not working, then they have a right to some form of insurance against that situation. So the document at one place says full employment or unemployment insurance and retraining programs. And it calls on the state to make sure that those things are in place. It also calls on the state to make sure that there are adequate wages and that there's explicit protection especially for vulnerable workers like immigrants. So in one place in the document, it says, it makes a very strong case for the preservation of what we know as the welfare state, the protection of vulnerable people from destitution. But then on the other hand, a little later in the document, it says that these systems have been subject to excesses and abuses, that they've become overly bureaucratized, and that the state cannot take over too much responsibility for this, that society and the family is where these responsibilities lie. Now this feeds right into the right-wing ideology that's so prevalent here in this country now and in other countries with the Tories, saying that we don't have to be responsible. The food banks will feed people. The government doesn't have to feed them. So it feeds into that whole ideology that the state does not have to intervene in the economy to make sure people eat. So what it gives on one hand, it takes away on the other. Now, to say a few words about, I've talked a lot about the rights of workers and what this document says about the economy and economics. Economics is a feminist issue. Women are actors in the economy, although you'd never say it from this document. This document talks about the worker and uses the male pronoun to talk about the worker. And it was interesting to read this document because I'm a strong proponent of inclusive language, but I don't think ever before has it become so clear to me the need for it. for just clarity, because throughout this document, the use of the male pronoun can be argued to mean workers in general. It can be argued to mean. But when you notice where women are explicitly identified, then you start to think, well, wasn't he talking about women back there, there, and there, and there, and there, where he said he? Well, really, he wasn't. And you start to recognize that because of where he does talk about women. And so it really highlighted for me how the use of exclusive, sexist, male supremacist kind of language really clouds what the document is saying about the rights of workers. This document defends the workers' right to an adequate wage. And throughout the document, that wage is called a family wage. Now, what that asserts is that the person who's working, the worker, has to earn enough money to support any dependents that worker has. Now, in and of itself, that's not a bad idea. But historically, what that has meant, well, the presupposition in this argument about the family wage is that we're talking about a family in which there is one worker, the man, who supports a woman who is at home and children who are at home. And that the historical struggle for wages was fought on that ground. But that historical struggle for the family wage was also used to undermine women's entering the workforce. And trade unionists, male trade unions, who were fighting for the family wage at the beginning of the century, actually undermined the fight for women to get adequate wages and to even be employed, because they thought that women entering the economy would undermine men's ability to fight for a family wage. So that's just one thing. The other thing in this is that it makes women's work totally invisible. That the only work and the only workers that are talked about in this document are workers, presumably male, who work in the waged economy. It makes women's work invisible, and women invisible in their own right. It presumes that women are dependent on men as the principal wage earners in the family. It presumes that women have the same status as children, as dependents of the male worker. Where it talks about the rights of women as workers, it lumps them with children. So that what it says about the working conditions, and where it repeats Rerum Novarum on this, it repeats the ideology of the time, which was that women and children should not be working in coal mines. Well, neither should men, thank you. You know, women and children should not be working in unsafe working conditions. And this is the kind of view that this document repeats. It puts women's work and women as workers on the same level as child labor. It presumes that women are physically weak. The fact that women are wage earners and that poor women have always been wage earners, poor women, low-income women, and black women, non-white women, immigrant women, have never, ever enjoyed the luxury of staying at home with their children. I mean, this phenomenon was confined to middle and upper class women, and increasingly only upper class women. This was never a norm for women across the whole of society. So it makes all the work of all those women in the waged economy invisible and meaningless and not subject to the rights that are enshrined in this document. It doesn't even acknowledge that women are in trade unions, that women's struggles in unions, both for leadership in those unions and to get women's issues generically defined on the agenda. It ignores that whole area of employment issues. It ignores and further makes invisible women's work in the informal economy. And all over the world, if any of you have been to places in the third world or know immigrant women here in Canada, that women are working all over the world in places where their work is never counted and where their wages never appear on any official transcript of the gross national product. And this document furthers the invisibility of those women and their labor. Finally, it makes women's work in the home totally invisible and uncounted. So women's work in all those sectors remains invisible, remains unmeasured, remains unconsidered. The worker is normatively male, and that this statement of workers' rights is around men's experience of work. Now, everything that the document enshrines about workers' rights, I want to say, yes, are the rights of women workers as well, of course. Women want to work in safe workplaces, women want a just wage, and so on. But there are other things that are specific to women's experience as workers that are not in this document. For example, the responsibility of the state and or the employer to provide adequate child care. How can women enter the workforce as workers and be paid the kind of wages that we are fighting for unless there is someone to take care of their children? Paid parental leave and benefits. Enough flexibility in work schedules and work time to care for sick children, children who are in school for half days, or children with special needs, or elder care. Most of the care done in this country and other places in the world of the elderly is done by women in the home, unrecognized and unwaged. The other big piece that this ignores around women's need in the workplace is the reality of sexual harassment. And this has just been, we've just had this big thing played out on national television with Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill that highlights this. But the fact that women workers are harassed both by their bosses and by their co-workers in the workplace. And that women workers should have the right to work unharassed. That need and that reality is totally missing from this document. There is no mention of pay equity, the fact that women in this country are earning two-thirds of what men are earning, or that around the world that gap is even wider. There's no mention of employment equity or employment practices that systematically exclude and discriminate against people of color, and especially women of color and disabled women and lesbian women. There is no mention in the document about training or education of women in non-traditional sectors. There is mention of retraining programs. There is no mention about the need to correct the gender inequity in training and education. There's no mention in the document about how women are concentrated in female ghettos in so many of our workplaces, in the service sector, in retail, in restaurants, in daycare, in clerical jobs, in dead-end jobs with low wages and no benefits, where unions have been squashed or not allowed to begin, the need to organize and support those women who are organizing. So for women in those sectors, the right to organize that this document proclaims remains a paper right. The other, I think, main thing to say about this, and this and many church documents, is what it says about the family. This document portrays the family, as does the church at large, as a sacred enclave that should be protected from state intervention, and that in times of economic or social hardship becomes a place where you go to be rejuvenated, to be nourished, and a place to escape the alienation of the public out there. In many ways, this document reiterates that false dichotomy between the public sector and the private. And it presumes that the family is a place to go where you can be safe. Well, I think we all know, and we know more and more, that the family is not a safe place for a lot of women and a lot of children. And this document totally ignores that. It ignores the horrific levels of wife assault. of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse that goes on in homes by spouses, especially toward women, predominantly toward women, and the sexual and physical and mental abuse of children. It also ignores the fact that for most people around the world, the nuclear patriarchal family that this document presumes is not a norm. That so many families, and a growing number in this society, are single-parent families, most of whom are headed by women and most of whom live in poverty. The last point I just want to make briefly is what this document presumes about women's roles. Women are only by accident and marginally talked about as workers. They're much more often talked about, where they are talked about, as being in the home. Catholic social teaching over and over again presumes that women's value, the value of women's work, is in its social and domestic realms, especially around the bearing and rearing of children. And in this document, the scandal of abortion, in quotation marks, is raised 3 or 4 times, side by side with statements that glorify human freedom of choice, how freedom of choice is essential to human freedom, how workers' freedom of choice around association and workplace is essential to human freedom. Well, I would submit that women's experience of mothering and childbearing and child-rearing is conspicuously absent from this document and others. Finally, a word about subsidiarity and solidarity. The document talks about subsidiarity, meaning that that those most affected, most immediately affected by a particular issue should have predominance in deciding how to resolve that problem or those needs. Well, I would suggest that, especially around women's rights, women's lives, issues of sexuality and reproduction, the Church has never, ever applied that. Around solidarity, the anti-poverty movement and the women's movement in which I work are movements that are peopled by Christians and non-Christians, religious people and atheists and agnostics, and many communists and socialists and other kinds of people. And that if the Church wants to talk about solidarity, it needs to talk about learning from these movements that are clearly committed to the kinds of values that it espouses, and that these movements are struggling to incorporate an ever broader number of people and experiences, and that while the Church holds up trade unions, it has shown no evidence of having learned from the experience of trade unions. And likewise, the popular movements that in other documents the Church has held up as a source of learning and a source of theology and a source of learning about our Christian commitment, there's very little evidence of that. So this document, I'm glad I read it. I'm going to shelve it.
This is a rather difficult act to follow because of the very moving presentation, and also because you were horning in some of my comments. So I congratulate you in any event. It's very interesting to hear that. So some of the things I have to say will be reiterating perhaps in other words, and I'll try to skip over those parts that do repeat some of the very excellent points I think that you made. I will begin by commenting on what's not there, and then get that out of the way, and then talk about what is. I am concerned about the use of sexist language. You've talked about that, certainly in the translation I read. A situation which distresses all of us, I guess, and distresses me in particular because it may discourage people from actually looking carefully at this document, and it does merit attention. Little is said about the role of women, and I think you've pretty much covered that, particularly in consumer societies, I would say, and I think that's basically the point you were making as well. Reference to which would have lent credence and depth to the otherwise moving pleas to place the inherent dignity of the individual at the core of social thought, which is the point that you were making. Population growth should have been addressed more thoroughly and more directly, thereby enhancing a document meant to challenge, when all is said and done, meant to challenge the prevailing orthodoxies, including that which suggests that we avoid painful confrontations with the complexities of the unconscionable maldistribution of wealth in our own society, as you mentioned, and also on this planet. So there's an opportunity missed there that should have been looked at very carefully. Finally, more could have been said about the role and potential of international agencies as devices to control economic institutions, which play people's lives and governments one off against the other. There is references made to that, but certainly the thought isn't developed. And there are others that I've mentioned here, I think, that you've covered. But I'm here to discuss what is in this encyclical, and I do so from the perspective of a political scientist, a Canadian political scientist in particular. And finally, from the perspective of a Catholic layperson who is concerned about the extent to which encyclicals, this or any other encyclical, is given an opportunity to inform political discourse in this country. I will return to that particular point at the end of my comments. I think it's important that we acknowledge at the outset that it's impossible to do justice to the document because it must be treated as an organic whole, as one of the other panelists has said. But in the time available, I propose to do the following without trying not to repeat what's already been said. To approach the reading of the encyclical from the perspective of a political scientist. In so doing, it is essential that three themes or topics be pursued, and that is ideology, the state, and power. With reference to each of these in turn, I will examine aspects of the document, as well as some of the commentaries it has evoked. And this isn't a systematic reading of the commentaries, it's kind of a scattered, the ones that interest me I gathered, usually the ones I disagreed with as well. The commentaries, it should be noted, are as important as the encyclical itself, because people read the commentaries, but they don't read the encyclical, as we all well know. Further, to examine the impact that the encyclical might have on a society or how it's been construed, of course, the commentaries are helpful. When I speak of ideology, and this is a difficult thing to define, but I will attempt to do so in a rather narrow way, I refer to the political and economic values, the beliefs, or the assumptions, or whatever you want to call them, which underlies the priorities which drive societies and which drive individuals. Put more bluntly, as a political scientist, when ideas become successful in academic or public circles, the question the political scientist instinctively asks is whose interests are being served. This encyclical is not an ideological document in that narrow sense of it. In both its letter and its spirit, it's addressed to all people and supposedly to address all concerns, subject to the limitations that you've mentioned, the ones that I have reiterated here at the outset. It is rather a document which is highly critical of ideologies, as you know, as was its predecessor 100 years before, which criticized liberalism and Marxism as it was known in those days. The present document is above ideology in the sense that it rejects the priorities and assumptions of the dominant ideologies of our time, because it is concerned with the spiritual dimension, of course, when all is said and done. But to say it's above ideology is not to suggest it's beyond it. And I think this is important. There is within it what I see as an ideological bias. Just to give you an example, at the beginning of chapter 3, which talks about Eastern Europe, there is the following reference, and I quote now, "In situations strongly influenced by ideology, in which polarization obscured the awareness of human dignity common to all, the Church affirmed clearly and forcefully that every individual bears the image of God and therefore deserves respect." What is interesting about this reference is it starts by saying situation strongly influenced by ideology. When liberal capitalism is mentioned, it is usually not referred to in similar ideological terms. There is a reference at the end of chapter 4, for instance, about the danger of the spread of what is called a radical capitalist ideology, which could be attractive as a device to fill the void left by the collapse of communism. But generally speaking, liberal capitalism is not seen in ideological terms. I emphasize this point because one of the notable characteristics of liberal capitalism, and I think you were referring to it in a different sense in what you said, but it's basically, I guess, the same point. One of the notable characteristics of liberal capitalism, on this continent at least, is its ideological subtlety. In Canada, and even more so in the United States, there are relentless efforts to limit meaningful participation in public policy debates, particularly on the part of those who challenge them in any sort of fundamental way, at least, not just the froth on the surface, but fundamental challenges. Any attempt to do that, they attempt to assure us that policies are made on non-ideological, practical grounds. Pragmatism implies, of course, this value-free political world. Policies are made by adopting whatever measures are best for all of us. And our politicians spend countless hours and countless millions of dollars telling us so from all parties. While I think of that, you made a reference earlier, this document is something for everybody. Some of the political parties could certainly do with this kind of writing, cover everything. But that's part of what they do when they try to tell us that these things are pragmatic. And those who attempt to challenge this notion are pilloried for introducing extraneous considerations such as values into objective discussions. It certainly happened during the free trade debate in this country, as some of us know from very hard experience. It happened to the Canadian bishops' statement, Ethical Reflections, in the early 1980s. You all remember they were told in no uncertain terms that the political and economic realms had no place for such irrelevant considerations as values and so on. What business have they got talking about economics? And I want to talk about that discipline in a minute. Well, as J.M. Keyes wisely warned us, and I've cited this in various things I've written in this area, practical people who believe themselves to be exempt from intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. And his comments underscores the strength of liberal capitalist ideology. It permeates, that ideology permeates all that we do in the public realm in this country and in North America, as well as the discipline of economics. In its mainstream, economics is a discipline which, as the bishops pointed out in another statement that they made brief to the Royal Commission on Economic Union and Development Prospects for Canada, this is a discipline that has been drained of moral content. And it's interesting. And a number of economists are starting to think about this, and heaven help us, even the business section in the Globe and Mail this morning, the Report in Business magazine, I see the editor, David Olive, has finally written something saying, wait a minute, Adam Smith didn't quite say it the way that we've been following it all these years. But what concerns me about the discipline, and it's this discipline that has become the new religion of the governing crowd in this country, is that the victims of the consequences of blind adherence to liberal economic thought are seen simply as kind of inevitable roadkills on this great road to economic progress. Where the people who are hurt by this situation, this happens to be a rather putrid and unfortunate consequences, but nonetheless, it's the price one has to pay. During the course of the free trade argument that went on in this country for a long time before the last election, I had the opportunity to debate it with an executive of one of the largest corporations in Canada, who began his comments by saying, "We can't let a concern about a bunch of people being out of work deter us from this road that we must follow." The whole notion, and some very thoughtful economists now are turning their attention to this, saying, what is the object of a discipline? And the object of a discipline, presumably, is to serve humanity. And we've turned it upside down. It's to serve abstract economic models. And it's also a discipline that brooks little opposition, as some of my colleagues have discovered. I labor this point because ideological domination comes in two guises. In the form of terrible oppression, such as that found until recently in Eastern Europe. That's one format. But there is another form. It's a much more subtle, but equally terrible repressive form, as is experienced under what I call the seductive yoke of liberal capitalist ideology on this continent. Now, the encyclical does address and does see liberal capitalism as a yoke. But the failure to see it in ideological terms takes the sting out of it. And this is reflected in the commentaries that I've read on the encyclical, described by one observer as, quote, giving the expiring body of Marxism a sharp kick. That was his summary of the encyclical. By another as offering a ringing endorsement of the free economy. and by yet another is sending the authors of the American Bishop's pastoral letter, Economic Justice for All, that these people should be sent back to the drawing board. Commentaries from that approach point out that the Pope also called for necessary corrections to our system here. But it's always seemed, well, we got to straighten this up, but we're okay. But there is no question for them as to where the scales are tipped. What these commentaries are saying is the kind of thing that we've heard in academic economic circles in recent years. Friedrich Hayek's outlining the errors of socialism, saying, ultimately when all is said and done, we are unable to shape the world about us and we must let the market do that for us. Or the other, a very absurd piece, The End of History, celebrating the triumph of liberal capitalist democracy, which was popular a couple of years ago. There are equally enthusiastic commentaries from other points of view, which point quite rightly to the Pope's, what I think, if it's read carefully, a very devastating critique of liberal capitalist societies. And these commentaries say less about what's going on in Eastern Europe, for instance. The reaction, those commentaries, some of which I just touched on very, very quickly now, demonstrate my point. The extent to which North America's society is, in spite of protestations to the contrary, and in spite of us being aware on it, that we live here in this continent in a society that is deeply and abidingly ideological. They are very deep, and it's something we all go around thinking, we just do what's best, but they're much deep. And you can see it in the commentaries, in North American commentaries. Having read the encyclical, I hope carefully, I think issue can be taken with most of the observations that I've read that others have said about this thing. It is an encyclical which provides little solace, I think, when all is said and done, for either the left or the right, for the East or for the West, or for the North, and certainly not for the brand of liberal capitalism practiced in sophisticated and developed countries. Certainly that's the spirit of it, and I agree with your commentary on its shortfalls in terms of application. I want to get to that. But the spirit of the thing is it doesn't hold one. There is a bias in it, granted, but it doesn't say, this is good and this isn't, and so on. It's a devastating critique of Western society as well. Anyone who's entirely comfortable with this document has yet to absorb it, in my view. It is not ideology or political values which are to measure the appropriateness of our social order, it says. It is the inherent dignity of people and their right for a full, proper, and fulfilled life that is to be our guide. And no amount of sloganeering by those who take out of this thing what they might want to take out of it, from no matter what perspective, can change that. As a result, no social order can claim victory, because we have yet to seriously strive for, let alone reach, the kind of ideals that are talked about here. And as you mentioned, as mentioned by some of the other panelists, what's important about this is the ideals that are there. Concerning the appropriate role of the state, the second of my categories, and a question, of course, is central to my discipline. The document is, when all is said and done, somewhat enigmatic, and I think that's already been covered. It challenges a totalitarian state, which tends to absorb within itself the nation, the society, the family, religious, and so on. There are references to authentic democracy, possible only in a state ruled by law, and so on. I am somewhat concerned about the question that you raised about freedom, and they say particularly of ideological or religiously ideological groups. I don't know what kind of society the reference is to there. I wish that should have been developed more further. What interests me, and there are a number of people, members of the Catholic Church, who are very concerned about the shape of our society, given that the demand is made there that when Catholics are in a minority, if I can be somewhat liberal now in my interpretation of this section, the demand being there that when we are in a minority, let's say, that we should have the right to practice what we believe, and we should have the right to tell others about what we believe. Do we in turn reciprocate in that kind of demand when we happen to be in a majority? And I don't think that question is adequately addressed. Personally, I don't have much problem with the values and the priorities that are outlined here. I happen to agree with them. But in a pluralistic society, there are those who see the church as rampantly ideological. okay, and fanatical on questions such as abortion or even divorce. And where should we then turn on these matters? If we are to demand freedom in democratic and pluralistic society for our values and for our views, do we in turn reciprocate when there are those who quite sincerely believe us, disagree with us, or those who quite sincerely cannot believe what we happen to believe? That question is left unanswered. Finally, on the role of the state, there are some commentaries who suggest that the Pope has pronounced socialism dead, endorsed the free market, strongly criticized the welfare state. I think his criticism of the welfare state is carefully nuanced. And I think I've read carefully, I was sent back to look at it again. Some of the criticism he made of the welfare state, interestingly enough, are not unlike some of the criticisms that have been made of the welfare state by the left in Canada, by prominent people, members of the left in Canada. So I think that part it's not very well developed. That particular, it's a short little paragraph. I remember it's not very well developed, but I think that has been misconstrued by those. And I did read one commentary that says, and also he's dismissed the welfare state. Well, the person hadn't read the document very, 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 very carefully. The state is necessary. I think it's throughout the document. We see examples where the state is necessary to rectify some of the problems. Now, just what extent state role is necessary isn't spelled out there clearly. As a political scientist, I ran for that because we've been arguing about that for a couple thousand years as to what the appropriate role of the state is. But I think there is food for thought there. But for those who try to take out of this that it favors this, that, or the other thing, I think they're misconstruing it. Obviously, the former states of Eastern Europe are criticized, but there's also the criticism of the consumer society, the liberal individualistic state. If I can just cite, and this comes from Chapter 2, let me just cite this: the liberal individualistic state, which seeks to defeat the left on the level of pure materialism by showing how a free market society can achieve a greater satisfaction of material human needs than communism, while equally excluding spiritual values. In reality, while on the one hand, it is true that this social model shows the failure of Marxism to contribute to a better society. On the other, insofar as it denies an autonomous existence and value to morality, law, and culture, it agrees with Marxism in the sense that it totally reduces man to the sphere of economics and the satisfaction of material needs. And that kind of thing, it's on the one hand, on the other hand thing, but that kind of thing is there. Finally, with regard to power, I think there is much in the document which Canadians can use, and I disagree with the comment that was made just here previously. I think we can tease out these things to inspire us because there's nice statements there which question the priorities and values of the wealthy in terms of economics and the glib and the privileged who form our political elites, to whom we too often defer in this society. In outlining the various principles of solidarity and that of people over profits and so on, it clearly challenges those who tell us to ignore those who are harmed by the priorities we're currently pursuing, and that ultimately the proposals are in the interest of us all, and all we have to do is wait 1 year or two and we're going to see the consequences of this and we'll all be better off, and so on. But I think the importance of the document is this: in bringing a perspective on the unconscionable disparities of wealth and income and opportunities and hope from a universal perspective. It is from this that the encyclical has potentially the greatest contribution to make. Free of the political constraints imposed on even the most distinguished of international bodies, the Church, when it speaks on social issues, is in a unique position to document and pronounce on the international situation. And I agree with some of the criticisms made here earlier that it's a Eurocentric document. I agree with that. But I'm also saying that there are things there that are worth considering that come from a perspective you can't find anyplace else. Perhaps the unfortunate thing is it's not universal enough in its perspective. But the implication, the Church is in this unique position to document and pronounce on the international situation, the implications of the dynamics of a world economy, the international marketplace, the staggering debt loads of third world, the selfishness and the amorality of the developed countries, the massive proportions of worldwide poverty, of the many, while the few live in security and affluence. And the pleas for change in lifestyles and so on. There is no other body on earth that's in a position to make those kinds of demands, that is above or can be above the fray in that sense. And no other institution on earth is in a position to challenge the established structures of power which are in place nationally and internationally, which promote and sustain such injustice, and which it's that which constitutes the heart and soul of this document, I think, that potential is there, that it should inspire study and so on, because it is coming from a source that is, in one sense of the word, above the fray. Now, I'm saying it's biased and there's other serious problems with it, I understand that, but potentially, this is where the direction has to come from. Particularly, and this is talked about right at the first, we're living in this society where the national barriers are coming down. And I wish, as I said at the outset, more had been said about, the international, what kind of international regulation or control over the flow of resources and capital and so on. I mean, this is something that there should be more of in the document. But it's for these reasons that I've just mentioned, whatever its shortcomings, and there are many, that it should be read, reread, taught, and disseminated throughout our society and indeed throughout the world. And that brings me to my last point, and I see I'm really out of time here, but as some of you know, and there was a reference made to my earlier work on this morning, is that I am concerned about this. What happens to these things? I guess I'm asking part of the same question you do. What happens to these things? Are there structures, are there facilities, procedures available which will allow careful discussion of this? You can, as I mentioned some of the commentaries here, take out of this document pretty much whatever you like. I can see Brian Mulrooney standing up the next election time citing from this. He's done worse. But because you can take various things out of it if it's not read carefully. And what is the appropriate form within the church that this might be discussed? And what is the appropriate form to take it beyond that? Now, Sister mentioned some of the possibilities this morning. She told people like me to get off the bishop's backs and get out and do it on our own. But okay, and I should talk to you more about that. I'm not quite sure how to go about that. All I know is that in recent years, I and many of my colleagues, but just to use my own example, are involved in many of the public debates in this country. And I go into schoolrooms, and I go into to town halls, and I go into university lecture rooms, and church basements, and so on, but not Catholic church basements. And there's a problem there. So what's going to happen to this thing? And I emphasize that because you can take various things out of it. It's interesting that some of our bishops have said, when talking about other issues, sometimes those which they defined as moral issues, that you teach through illustration. You don't use the language of the seminary and so on. But we do use the language of the seminary when we talk about these kinds of things. And that's not good enough. And the bishops have pulled back, as you know, my view is, at least over the years, in being specific, saying, okay, where are we going to get, why do we say specifically what should be done? But that kind of leadership is provided. And you don't bind people to it, say, we think this is what you should do. Well, then they follow their conscience and do it. But how else do you teach this kind of document? Because it does use very general kinds of terms and so on. We've all put our own kind of interpretation on it. And I think generally we're coming from maybe the same perspective to begin with, which is why we don't have deep disagreements right here, among the three of us at least. But how do you get this information out there? Because if not, it's used for various purposes. And I say what is more distressing is I think that we give up on it. It calls to mind Galbraith's comment about comforting the afflicted without afflicting the comfortable. That, this statement can comfort the afflicted. But the only way you're going to give them real comfort is to do something about afflicting the comfortable. And we haven't quite got to that stage. And I await your instructions, I guess, on where we might go on these things. But anyway, thank you.
General Jaruzelski was unpopular in Poland. So So he prayed to the Lord. He wasn't really an atheist. He prayed to the Lord and said, Lord, what can I do to make myself loved by the Poles? And the Lord suggested to him that he walk across the river Vistula in Warsaw. He said, I can't do that. And the Lord said, strength will be given to you. So off he goes. A crowd gathers on both banks, and tentatively at first, and then with more assuredness, he crosses over and reaches the other side. And the Pope said, typical Jaruzelski, can't even swim. And here the Pope produces a social encyclical, and you say it totally ignores sexual harassment, it totally ignores wife assault, it totally ignores the single-parent family, it totally ignores the expense of childbirth. Well, bloody hell, you know. Typical Jaruzelski, can't even swim. I think one ought to talk about what's in documents rather than what's not in them, frankly. It's as a point of method. The question about it being Euro-centred is quite evident to me. You people haven't the faintest idea of the drama of the things that have been happening in Europe. The ending of the Cold War is not a minor affair. It affects the entire future of the planet. And if it's Euro-centred, that's because where this has happened. Anyway, you've got to write from some point of view, unless you think you can, I don't know what, stand out of the whole world and survey it from nowhere, as it were. Rome, at the very least, is a very good listening post. In the old days, I'm sure you have a picture of the British diplomats as regular old buffers. Well, you're absolutely right. Before we had an ambassador to the Holy See, we had a minister. And these ministers, when appointed, used to come to the Tablet Dining Club, the Tablet Table. Tablet's the weekly magazine, because the Foreign Office couldn't brief them about what to do in the Vatican. So they'd come along, Sir Mortimer Dedlock, or whatever their names were, Creepy Crawley. I remember somebody was known as Creepy Crawley. Creepy Crawley came along and said, I'm going off to the Vatican, and British minister, I have the faintest idea what to do. You chaps have got to help me. And one of the Tablet Knights of them, as I thought of them, always been second secretary in Bern or someone like that, said, well, Creepy, great thing you've got to remember is you've got absolutely nothing to do. That's the first thing. But keep your ear to the ground and you'll find it's a first-rate listening post. And I think that is true of Rome, that it is a first-rate listening post for so many international things. Apart from the church, it's got the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. So one can follow that as well as many other things in Rome. The most international bodies in the church, possibly in the world, are the religious orders. And there isn't a single bit of the globe that isn't covered in one way or another. So it's written from Rome, and it's written about Europe, and I don't think one should blush for either of those things. And if you think Centesimus Annus is Euro-centred, what should you say of Rerum Novarum? Imagine the right of association being preached to the coolies in Hong Kong, let's say, in the year 1891, or to the inhabitants of Congo, as it was then called, now Zaire. I don't think the message would have got across. I don't think Catholic social teaching was for Europe. It was devised in Europe. E. White Hales once read that the image that Leo XIII had of the family was of the humble cottager returning home at night to his thatched cottage, there to eat his frugal meal, his 10 children sustained, fortunately, by the fact that he was earning a just wage. And that was the sort of world envisaged by Leo XIII. Leo XIII, by the way, I rather like this thought which has often occurred to me. What was his experience of modern industry? Well, he grew up in the Campagna around Rome. Principal industry, banditry. He was Bishop of Perugia for 40 years. Principal industry, chocolate making. There's little chocolates called baci, kisses. That's what comes from Perugia. There's no other industry in Perugia, apart from tourism and a university. However, his one contact with the modern world was 3 years spent in Belgium when he was papal nuncio. So I suppose Belgium in the 1830s, he saw a few through his carriage window. He would have seen a few factory chimneys. So he didn't really have much experience of the modern world. And if you go and look at who wrote Rerum Novarum, you'll find it was written by 2 barons, 6 counts, and 2 dukes. All excellent Catholic laymen, no doubt. Now, you ask, who wrote Centesimus Annus? That's another question we haven't even gone into. If we do go into that, there is a Canadian economist among them, whose name I've forgotten, but he has been mentioned. A point that has to come up, which I think you, Janet, raised this one. How far is this document an act of appeasement towards the US administration? You see, I mentioned the fact that Michael Novak and co. thought that Sollicitudo Res Socialis was, they didn't like that because it put capitalism and communism on the same level as imperialistic forces. Incidentally, I invented a new encyclical. Did anybody notice? Called Sollicitudo Rerum Socialium. Yes. Anyway, so that charge was made, and Novak went to Rome to protest about this. I asked him if he actually saw anybody of consequence, and the truth is that he didn't. He saw Cardinal Echegaray, president of the Justice and Peace Committee, for about 3 minutes. He didn't see the Pope at all, and he saw Ratzinger at some length. But these people think that they influenced the Pope by their pressure to make Centesimus Annus more favourable to capitalism than the previous one was. Now, of course, is it more favourable or is it not? I don't really believe it is all that more favourable, although there is this peculiar bit about social security. You are quite right. That sticks out like a sore thumb. That's a piece of Reaganomics or Thatcherite stuff, you know. If you have too much social security, people will become culturally dependent on it and they'll never stand up on their own 2 feet, which they should do in proper capitalist society. Now, what's that doing there? Well, there is an explanation of these changes, and here this has to be a little bit of Vaticanology, inside track Vaticanology. Cardinal Echegaray, president of the committee which drafted the document, had finished his work last November. Consequently, by the time and handed it in, when he arrived in February to celebrate in Washington to celebrate 100 years of Rerum Novarum, he already knew, or thought he knew, what was in the Pope's encyclical, but of course he couldn't talk about it and couldn't divulge it. Nevertheless, he made an important speech about how this was the hour of Catholic social doctrine, which I was half quoting from. And he also said, which he says repeatedly, that although the Church doesn't have any models for political society in the sense of blueprints or policies that you can say, follow these and everything will be well, there is one sense in which the Church has a model for society, namely the Eucharist, which is one of the few institutions, it is the only institution in the world which brings together people of great diversity, different classes, different races, different cultures, in principle. So, I mean, that's the point about the Eucharist, I suppose. The Eucharist, or the Church itself, through the Eucharist, as saying something about a multiracial, multicultural society. Okay. He then came back from the United States. We are now in early March, but March the 4th, he's summoned to the Secretariat of State and told that the encyclical is not satisfactory and certain changes are going to have to be made. He inquires as to the nature of these changes, and he's told that the view is that the United States has been so upset by the Pope's opposition to the Gulf War that he wants to use the encyclical as a means of holding out an olive branch to the U.S. administration. Echegaray says, I'm not playing. You asked me to provide the social doctrine of the church. I did my best. That's what it is. That's what our team came up with. You can do it yourself. Well, that was no problem. So Father Georges Cotier of the Order of Preachers, a Swiss, and Rocco Bottiglione, those of you who have heard me over the last 3 days will by now know the name of Rocco and his brothers. His sister actually is the head of Italian TV. Rocco Bottiglione, for those who don't know, is 43 years old, pipe-smoking professor of philosophy from Perugia. He is a member of Comunione e Liberazione, a movement, a new movement which has political dimensions. I will say no more than that. And he's the Pope's philosophical, most admired philosopher, the only person the Pope quoted when he went home to Poland in June this year. So they produced the modifications, and they introduced the passage about social security scrounging, which is totally at odds with Catholic social teaching. You can't make an option for the poor and at the same time think the poor are cheating you out of their, right, left, and centre. I think this whole thing's totally absurd. So I exhort you to remember how dramatic it's all been. And it also involves you too, because after all, the CSCE process, may I remind you, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, Canada is a member of that, so is the United States, and so is the Holy See. It's the first time the Holy See has participated in an international conference since the Council of Vienna. And this organization, which was originally designed to modify, as it were, the harshness of the Cold War, has now got an entirely different function, or is gradually acquiring a different function. And it's the embryo of a larger European community. So it's extremely important. I, frankly, resent people saying this is Eurocentric. Because for another thing, Europe is acting as a powerful magnet. And now Africa, there are moves toward democracy in Africa. And your Prime Minister, for whom you appear to have not the slightest regard, I'm not surprised. People never do, but it seems to me he was raising a very important point at the Commonwealth Conference in Harare, when he said, shouldn't aid be linked to human rights and democracy in the Commonwealth? That's going too far, says Robin Mugabe. You can't do that sort of thing. Well, why not? Why not? It is that which is tying in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary. That is to say, they know if they start having dictatorships, if Lech Wałęsa becomes the strong man, then that's the end of their application for membership of the European Community, just as Spain and Portugal had to get rid of their dictatorships. Now, this contagion, can this contagion spread? There's even a bit of it in Latin America. So, short shrift for that. Have I anything else to say? Yes, I've just one little thing to say. And perhaps I'm going to complain about the Pope. I seem to have been rather praising him, don't I? So let me play a more traditional part. One thing that I've very much wish he could understand is that consumerism is not necessarily a pejorative term. He uses consumerism as a synonym for materialism. So, you denounce hedonism, pornography, drugs, consumerism, materialism, all in one go. Well, as I understand it from Ralph Nader, consumerism is a movement which helps people become wise and discriminating consumers, helps, therefore, them to defend themselves against the transnational corporations and all the rest of it, and is a factor for progress and the alert citizen. And it helps the civic culture we're all looking for, civil society. So, Cardinal Basil Hume is going to make a little note on the subject of consumerism at the Synod when it happens shortly, and I know that because I know that, and he told me. Well, I suggested it, and he agreed. He's also, you might like to know, going to have a dream at the Synod. And the dream will embrace the Third World in as satisfactory a manner as anybody could wish. That's all I've got to say.
We're not about to have a dream because we're pretty well cleaned out, but this has been an absolutely wonderful afternoon, and I'd like to thank Peter and Paul. Janet, you break the rhythm.
Yeah, I know.
Peter, Paul, Janet, and Terry, thank you very, very much for a wonderfully diverse and insightful afternoon. Common room is true.
And efforts to try to see him were made impossible, and the reading in terms of the pastoral agents, the 250 pastoral agents that gathered together from all over the diocese to take an analysis of the situation, was that this is the new beachhead of the repression, that the church is now the target, and the reason is that the church institutionally has supported these struggles, and that if you're going to undercut these struggles, you've got to undercut the church in the region. Now, what does this all have to do with what we've been talking about in terms of Fortress America? Or what does this have to do about an alternative? Well, what it has to do is that, as Bishop Samuel Rees told us, is that because this repression is magnified many times over in the last 5 months, is that they can only conclude that it's directly related to the free trade negotiations. And one of the reasons for this is that in order for Salinas to be able to secure a better bargaining position at the negotiating table with regards to migrant workers crossing from Mexico into the United States, remember my first story, is for him to be able to demonstrate that he can exercise social control in the pressure points of refugees in the southern part of his country, that's to say along the Guatemalan-Mexican border. And furthermore, that if he is going to be able to show that he can control movements, popular movements in his country, relative to the future development of a continental free trade accord, especially with the fact that the agribusiness companies that want to come in and take over the land that the peasants are insisting is their land and are occupying and refuse those companies to come in, or the forest companies that want to come in and rip out the timber at a very rapid rate in those areas, and they're taking a stand against that. That somehow you got to repress that popular opposition. You got to show that you can control it. Hence, your bargaining position either goes up or goes down at the negotiating table, depending on your capacity to exercise control in the situation. Now, again, what does this story have to tell us about what we have to say about alternatives? Is this an alternative model of church? Have we seen in other parts of the Third World similar examples, and we, I think, have, of where the church, through basic Christian communities and other forms, have really found a way of expressing the gospel's demands for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation by standing up and resisting these kinds of external forces and pressures, and by mobilizing people in the regions to address these issues. And I think this is what we are seeing in Chiapas at the present moment. How long it will last and whether or not the full force of the state will crush it remains to be seen. But that's what's at stake, and make no mistake about it. So we are asking ourselves at this point, is there an alternative model of church that's emerging here? Is this not an example of what I would call prophetic church or prophetic communities? Do we not see here the fact that there is an alternative model of church that is prophetic, that is based upon basic ecclesial communities, that's rooted in a liberation theology, that's comprised of the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed, and where people gather together in terms of those struggles and reflect on those struggles, those everyday living events in the light of the gospel itself. And we know that post-Vatican II, with the Medellin Conference of the Latin American Church, that this is precisely a new model of church that was stimulated. We know that in the case of Brazil at one point, 250,000 of these basic ecclesial communities were actually formed. We know that there were attempts to try to put together prophetic Christian communities that really were engaged in frontline struggles for justice and peace, and that really posed a radical alternative to the dominant model that existed regarding the institutional church, namely the bourgeois church. But what is it that lies behind this prophetic model of church? What are the kinds of themes that we need to call into account and remember? And from my way of thinking, I think that I look at what people like Metz and Gutierrez and Boff and others remind us of, and that is that this prophetic tradition that we're talking about is really based upon a dangerous memory, a memory that reminds us that in our own biblical heritage there is a prophetic faith that moved from Moses through the prophets to Jesus, but that to really recall that faith and that tradition is an exercise in what Metz calls dangerous memory, because it is a frightening, challenging, and courageous kind of witness. That Moses, the prophets, and Jesus were all, through their ministries and the stances that they took and the prophetic positions that they maintained, really stood up against the established order of their times, that they sought not to simply accommodate to the established order of their times, but to actually transform it or try to transform it. That behind all of this is a kind of mosaic foundation, as Brueggemann would remind us of, and that is that Moses himself broke from imperial Egypt to try to introduce a politics of justice and compassion, and that is a fundamental foundation that Moses left and passed on, and that the prophets themselves picked that up in terms of cultivating a prophetic consciousness that was based upon the politics of justice and compassion. And that this prophetic consciousness was based also on a dialectic, which on the one hand encouraged people to critique and denounce oppression when they saw it, and at the same time to energize people to develop an alternative community and an alternative vision of what the world could be look like. We saw this in the prophets like Jeremiah and 2nd Isaiah. In the case of Jeremiah, being able to show without any question his ability to exercise passion and pathos and feeling regarding people's grief, to use that grief and that anger and to address and identify the power structures that were causing it. And in the case of 2nd Isaiah, the capacity to invite people to radically energize themselves about what sense of hope there might be in the future and what alternatives there may be. Jesus seemed to combine these two elements in his own ministry, starting, of course, with his own solidarity with the victims, and in many ways exemplified in his crucifixion and his resurrection, this sense of critique and this sense of hope for the future. Well, it seems to me that these are all parts of our faith tradition, all of which would take a long time to go into if we were really to unpack them and really understand them. But I think that they do point to a different model of church, one I saw in Chiapas, one I saw exercised by the people, by the pastoral agents and by the people of that diocese. And we've seen it elsewhere as well. It's not only here, we've seen pockets of it in our own country, and we've certainly seen it in other parts of Latin America and other parts of the Third World. But let's look very briefly at some of those elements of this prophetic church. It is definitely rooted in what I would call, or some people call, the Mosaic foundations and the Mosaic tradition, as distinct from the Davidic tradition, which seems to exemplify a sense of church built on the model of Christ the King. We're talking about a model of church that sees the central problematic not being one of faith and freedom, or even faith and tradition, but one of faith and justice, one of faith and justice in relationship to peace and also the future of creation itself. We're seeing a model of church that calls for a general attitude not of helping people accommodate and cope with the world, the new world order, but helping people to be equipped to challenge and to change and to transform that new world order. We're looking at a model of church that makes its main alliance first and foremost with the victims of that new world order, the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor themselves, but mainly understanding it as the victims of the way in which that Fortress America or that new world order is operating. We're also seeing a model of church that's rooted in an image of Jesus that is not based on Christ the King, but is based first and foremost on a notion of the prophetic suffering servant. We're seeing a model of church that is not sort of based on parishes, sort of running in a supply service system through the sacraments, but a model of church that first and foremost is rooted in grassroots communities of people experiencing struggles in life, coming together, reflecting on those struggles in the light of the gospel, and then identifying actions for the future. Now, what does this say when we bring this back to Canada? Where does this model of church fit in relationship to the bourgeois model of church we just talked about, and whether or not the future of the church in Canada really can help us to address the challenges that we're going to be faced with regarding this New World Order and this Fortress America? Can this model of church really help us to get in touch with the frontline struggles of people who are going to be hit hardest and first and foremost, and are already being hit hard right now regarding the building of this Fortress America that we talked about? What about the factory workers and the plant shutdowns? Are we talking about a church that's going to be in touch with them and on side with their struggles? With farmers facing these bankruptcies and with the elimination of marketing boards, which are going to wipe out our agricultural system in this country? What about the native people that are going to be faced with mega projects, be it James Bay or other things in the months ahead, in the years ahead? What about the people on social assistance, the people who are the so-called welfare poor in our country, but the people who are really facing the struggle of social assistance and the enormous cutbacks that are coming on that front? What about the people who are faced with the cutbacks in terms of health care that we're going to be facing in the next few years, and the crisis of Medicare, or refugees and the implosion of refugees from Central America and the pressure that's coming on that front? And we could go on the environmental front, and dealing with disabled people, and the concern about public service workers and the elimination of the public sector in our country, and on, as all part of the frontline attacks that are taking place with respect to this particular model of economy and this particular model of Fortress America that's coming to press upon us today. And so we need to ask ourselves, can we actually build a model of church in this country that really takes seriously solidarities with the victims? And that means being able to work side by side with people's organizations, with popular organizations, be they of farmers or of native people or of workers or of refugees, or of disabled people, working side by side with those people as they are faced with these kinds of hits and are therefore subject to this kind of victimization. And how to do that, not simply through our own model, but also working in coalitions so that we can realize that these hits are being made across the board and that no one group and no one struggle can survive alone, but we must unite together through coalitions to fight these kinds of agendas. Can we build a church that really does take seriously a radical critique of this Fortress America and also puts forward a radical alternative? Now, the radical critique itself would lead to one major form of action that's left to us, and that's resistance. There's no sense in playing around anymore. We are getting to the point where there is no other option left but people to mobilize to resist in a fairly massive way the kinds of changes that are taking place. At the same time, to be able to put forward a radical alternative that has a sense of hope in it, that people can really rally around regarding the future of our economy and our society, and also with regards to the future of our continental relationships. Can we put together a model of church that really has a sense of being a prophetic community and a network of prophetic communities, that here in Ontario, for example, that there would be a network of prophetic communities organized all over the province that would relate and come together in some kind of an assembly, that we would set our own agendas, that we would develop our own work ahead and recognize the kind of priorities and mission that we need to work on, that we would realize also that these kinds of prophetic communities need to be a part of the building of broader social movements through coalitions, and that unless we make strategic links with other groups through coalitions, we really are not in touch with the challenges that we're faced with today. And that finally, and this is, by the way, that's what we're trying to do through the Action Canada Network, is to help people get together across different sectors and across different regions to work together in a new way of acting. And finally, to be able to work in terms of international linkages. One of the great things that's happened, for better or for worse, I guess, in terms of this whole work on continental free trade, is that over the last 14 months, incredible linkages and relationships have developed between networks and movements in Canada, in Mexico, and in the United States, in a whole new way of international action. And I suggest to you that's part of the future. You cannot address these issues sector by sector alone. You must unite within your own region and within your own country in a coalition way. At the same time, one must work internationally because one's dealing with transnational capital. If you don't understand how that world works and operates, of playing one region off against the other and sharing the information, then there's no way you can fight back. You have to have international linkages. Well, I'm going to draw this to a final close by just making a few brief final remarks, and we'll leave it at that. I hope that by passing through these different journeys that I've had through trying to come to grips with this whole notion of Fortress America, through the understanding of our model of church being primarily a bourgeois model of church that's inadequate to face up to the challenges of that new era, and of the need to move in a new direction in reinventing the church in terms of what I call the formation of prophetic communities, that maybe in that journey you will see some of the things that we're faced with in terms of an agenda and challenges for the future. I don't want to leave the impression, however, that one should be naive about all of this, that this can happen, that this kind of transition can take place, that we can bring it about. We have to recognize that there are powerful forces that are working against moving in the direction I've just suggested. And unless we understand that, we're just being foolish. I think we have to understand how those forces are gathered in various ways at the Vatican level, but also in various formations within our own country, in church, and the way in which the corporate boardrooms discuss the role of the church and how to make sure it controls the operations of the church in this area. Maybe we need to realize, as Gregory Baum has sort of indicated, that the period of Kairos is over, that is to say, that period in which we had exciting challenges and reading the signs of the times and we could respond to them as we were able to in the 60s and the 70s. I realize that maybe we've gone into a wilderness now in which we're going to have to take the time to reflect, to mourn a bit, and to reflect, and to try to look for a new day and be prepared for that new day. I'm not ruling that out at all. But I am saying this, that I think that unless we understand the signs of the times, unless we understand that those forces are in front of us, that they have a lot to do with the future of this country, and if we really love Canada as a nation, we're going to have to think about this in a whole new way, and we're going to have to build a model of church that's going to equip us to address those issues. And I don't feel that we have the model of church in place to do that. We have some elements and some experiences of it here and there, but we must really be diligent about building new forms and new models of church. And I'm suggesting to you that this prophetic model of church is a direction in which we have to go in. I'm also suggesting to you that that this will call for a massive change at all levels. And because Metz himself has referred to this as the Second Reformation, that we're going to have to realize that a new religious consciousness and perhaps the Second Reformation may be necessary to really bring this about. But it's not going to be a reformation that is like the ones of the past, but it's going to have to be one that really faces the challenges that we face today. That we can't do this alone. That we must work side by side with non-believers. That we must work side by side with people who are really committed to an alternative vision of society and who are really committed to the politics of compassion and justice. I also believe that we cannot simply close the door and the chapter, and in fact we have to draw upon the strengths that have come from various theological movements, be it liberation theology or political theology of Europe, or feminist theology, or black theology or Aboriginal theology. In all of these cases, we have very important signals that help us look ahead to the future, and we must draw upon them. And finally, I think we have to realize that that we are really caught on a tightrope between hope and despair. That it's very easy, after the kind of picture we talked about this evening, to draw the line and to simply despair about the future. If there's anything about our faith, we are a people of hope. We are an Easter people. We are a people who do not allow ourselves to be dragged down by despair, even though that is a very human element. But that sense of hope cannot be cheap hope. Anybody who sits in this room who thinks that we can simply go about the kinds of changes we've been talking about without a great deal of pain and suffering and without a lot of struggle is fooling themselves. The hope that, that lies at the heart of this message and the hope that lies at the heart of the gospel message is a costly form of hope, a form of hope that will cost. And that's why dangerous memory is important. And that's why I think we have to prepare ourselves for moving in this direction. After all, we are a people of a faith that has both the crucifixion and the resurrection at the heart of our message. And that's why I believe very strongly that costly hope must be very much in front of us, that dangerous memory must be very much a part of that, and that we are called to be a prophetic community to face up to the challenges of this new world order and of this fortress America. So, my friends, I want to thank you for listening to me for a long time here, and my voice crackling and everything else. This is the end, unless you have any questions, but thank you very much. One final caveat that I want to put on this, and that is, if you think that I'm here representing the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops and what I say, wipe it off the record. I am not here speaking on behalf of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, but I am reflecting some challenges that I will be bringing forth to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops in the not-too-distant future. Sorry about that.
I think in deference to Tony's voice, we'd better abstain from questions. I think we're being invaded from the back as well. And there's coffee and juice out there. Maybe you would like to meet with Tony personally. I don't think, now that he's stopped talking, that his voice will resurrect itself again. I just like to, on behalf of all of us, say for myself that I have rarely heard, it's been a long time since I've heard such a passionate evocation of who we are as Canadians and who we are as a Canadian church. And I'd personally like to thank Tony enormously for that. I'm going to ask Michael Higgins to just express a few thoughts in gratitude. In case you're wondering what's happened, there's a concert happening afterwards, and the students are about to invade us for that. I hope you don't mind us abstaining from questions, but I think you've seen Tony disintegrating with passion before your very eyes. And so I think we need to owe him that courtesy of not having any questions. Michael?
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Tony, for your presentation tonight. I'm sure, I think we have 5 Devlin lectures tonight now, to add to the long tradition of Devlin lectures that we've had. And I want to add my comments as well to Mary Malone's, that there was a great deal of passion and conviction in tonight's presentation that helped, I think, for all of us to share something of this outrage and to share something of the importance, not only in Gregory Baum's phrase, of realizing that there is a sense in which this is a time of mourning, but to understand the creative dimension and component that rests in that time in the wilderness. Mary introduced Tony very briefly by referring to him as an eminence grise. I'm more accustomed to talking about an eminence rouge myself, but I have found in the past that Tony Clark is a remarkable resource for talking about the rouge and everything else. Is a man who understands the network of the Canadian political Catholic reality better than most. I can think of very few who would be equal, who brings an understanding of the complex and myriad dimensions of the Canadian political reality into a new kind of luminous kind of context, largely because he sees it through the eyes of faith and also because he sees it through the eyes of compassion. His involvement in numerous and several activities, his rich intelligence, his familiarity, as I said before, with all these various strains, and his continued employment with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, undoubtedly will assure us that his voice will be a constant one in Ottawa, if not in Washington. So thank you again, Tony Clark, for tonight's riveting Devlin lecture. There is one more major and wonderful event waiting for you, but I think it would be remiss of me not to take this opportunity as the Associate Dean of the College to thank Professor Mary Malone, the Director of the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience, who was the principal architect of this event. Peter Hebblethwaite, Paul Hansen, Francis Ryan, Janet Conway, Terry Downey, Tony Clark, Ted Schmidt, Andrew Cash, and others have come to make this an important moment in St. Jerome's memory, not always a dangerous memory, sometimes too soft a memory, but an important one still for that. And this Rerum Novarum conference will be etched in our collective memory for some time to come. Helen Heimpel and Eric Durstein have assisted Mary in the preparation of this, but none of it would have been possible without her tireless energy, her generosity, her hospitality, and her willingness to set about to arrange something like this right in the middle of an academic term, when she's teaching and has other demands upon her time. So I would like to take this occasion on behalf of the administration of the college to thank Dr. Malone for her energy and imagination in making all this possible. Now the play's the thing.
I'd just like to add my gratitude to everybody for being here and for those of you who survived with us right from the very beginning to the very end. So good night. You're welcome to stay for the concert if you have any energy left. And if you're not stampeded by the students on the way out, and I presume there's coffee and juice outside. So thank you very much, and good night and a safe journey.